To become a vampire is to stand on a precipice, tumbling into an abyss in which you've lost yourself to darkness. But to become a spawn is to be dragged into the void, trapped in your own body.
Welcome to the Forgotten Realms, the world of Ravenloft and Baldur's Gate 3. This is a world that is filled with elves, but how well do you really know what makes someone truly an elf? Spoiler, it's more than the race that you're born as. Now, it's time for a trigger warning. Normally, I'd make a joke here. I'd say something like, if you dislike gender-neutral and polyamorous people, you're probably going to dislike this video, so click off now. But if you love races that view all genders as equal and getting it on like wild rabbits, you're gonna love this one, babe. However, this video does need an actual trigger warning. In this video, we'll be discussing sexual assault, including during childhood. I'll do my best to contain all of the information around that topic into one chapter, and just know I will harbor no ill feelings if you skip that chapter. As someone who went through that myself, I understand it's a topic that's hard to discuss when your head is not in the right headspace. As well, I don't want to have a million beeps throughout this video, so moving forward, I'll be using YouTube Overlord friendly terms, including SA, CSA, DV, and spicy. They're in no way meant to undermine the topic. And with the heavy stuff out of the way, let's dive into how Astarion has lost everything that makes him an elf. Before we can explain how Astarion lost his true elf self, we need to go over what an elf is and what unique things make someone truly an elf. So grab your cozy drink and settle in, because this is a deep lore dive. Elves are also known as the Tel Quasir in True Tongue. And I'll pop that up written in Common and Espruar, the written language form of Elvish. According to the grand histories of the realm, the elves first came to Faerun from the Feywild. This often leads to other races, including their own subrace of Drow, calling them Fey or Fairy. Drow say it as an insult, whereas other humanoids, they mean it with no malice. However, Fey are their own classification, like how dwarves are humanoids and goblins are goblinoids. Some elves can have Fey ancestry. However, the elves themselves are ancient and they predate most Fey. As a side note, writing this section, I kept wanting to spell Fey, which is F-E-Y, as Fae, F-A-E. Because although I studied mainly Norse and Celtic folklore, I preferred the stories of the Fae, like that of Lu, who becomes the king of the Tuat de Dahanan. However, Fae and elves in the Forgotten Realms, they pull from a variety of Northern European lore, not just one specific background. Elves with Fae ancestors are Fae Oladrin. These elves still inhabit the Feywild beyond their trance. There are over 10 subraces of elf, each one falling into one of 4 primary categories. High elves, Sylvan elves, which are known as wood elves in Baldur's Gate 3, Drow, and other. In the game, Astarion is only listed as a high elf because Baldur's Gate 3 didn't break down the subraces deeper than that. So that's led to a lot of conjecture as to which subrace of high elf he belongs to. For some, they believe that he's a sun elf because his desires for power and political position prior to turning. However, he doesn't fit the description of sun elves. According to the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, sun elves tend to have bronze skin. And although vampires do become paler, they still hold the undertones of their former self. For example, looking at Cazador, you can see he still has the yellow and gold undertone that would have given him a warm complexion in life. As well, sun elves typically have black, red, copper, or golden hair. Sun elves were known to be bulkier and stronger than their moon counterparts, but they were less durable and nimble. Whereas I see Astarion more as being akin to a moon elf. Although his name means little star, he wouldn't be a star elf. He lives in the wrong plane. But astronomical names were common for moon elves as well. According to the races of Faerun, moon elves were known to have pale, fair skin with cool and neutral undertones. Their most common hair colors were black, blue, white, and silver. And like sun elves, the men were typically taller than women. However, unlike sun elves, moon elves tend to be a more slimmed, muscular build. Both of them are slimmer in general, because it's rare to have an elf as bulky as Halsin, but moon elves were even slimmer. Despite which subrace of high elf Astarion falls into, they experience elfhood the same way. But I am curious, Which subrace of High Elf do you think Astarion is? Comment below with a sun or a moon to let us know what you think. Unlike other humanoid races in D&D, elves do not get to have an afterlife. According to, and I'm going to butcher this just like many of my fellow players, Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, the original god of the elves, Corleon, punished the elves for choosing a primary human form rather than staying as flexible shapeshifters as he'd intended them to be. This punishment barred them from the afterlife, making it so that no elves could walk the fugue planes and be collected by their god. As well, it makes it so that there are no new elven souls. The closest an elven family could get to having a new souled child was to sire a half-elf. Half-elves, or the Cha-Tel-Quasir, come from the union of an elf and a human. Unlike humans, they can take up to 20 years to reach the end of adolescence. So, whereas their peers might start puberty around 13, they're more likely to start theirs around 18 to 20. Keep in mind, this is often mentally, not physically. And half-elves typically live to be about 180 years, compared to the minimum of 700 for their elven counterpart. Half-elves prided themselves on being half-elf as much as they did half-human, though they were more likely to worship gods from the Celadrine pantheon. And before you get confused, Celadrine is the name of a fellowship of elven gods. So when Baldur's Gate 3 named the subrace of drow Celadrine, they were implying that they were drow who worship gods still in the pantheon, as opposed to Lolth, who fell from grace. Elves who die are reincarnated, meaning they meet again in life after life. So if they're an elf with a soulmate who is also elven, they'll meet again in every single life. But this does require that their soul is able to leave their body in death. And in the Forgotten Realms, some types of death, undead, or rituals prohibit that from happening. It's important to note as we move forward, drow should be treated like their own race. Aside from this curse of limited souls and walking the trance, they have little else in common with primary elves, especially when it comes to societal norms. According to the complete Book of Elves, elves did not distinguish between males and females in any form of social norms, and so in no way discriminated based on gender. There were far more queens than kings among elves, but this tendency was not because of social preferences, but rather a natural happenstance that there were more women who were in the right place at the right time. Unlike other societies and humanoid races, elves understood the value and potential of women, and so their relationships thrived in equality between all partners. According to the 3.5e manuals, marriage and love are a somewhat fluid concept to elves. They see love and spicy times as separate, and can experience romantic love without having spicy time, meaning they can have some relationships that are ace that aren't aromantic. But elves hold spicy times as sacred. While most elves partake in spicy interactions for the sake of pleasure, it's far from recreational. To quote, "It's a ceremony, not a sport." They typically only have these interactions 1 to 3 times a month. They're slow to indulge as well. A single activity, like one using their speaking device to eat non-food things, please don't smite me, YouTube, can go on for several hours. Their spicy making sessions could last an entire day, although the ratio of spicy arrivals that a woman can achieve is still higher than a man, just like with most humanoids. After the, quote, ceremony, end quote, is completed, the elf will experience euphoria for 1 to 3 hours. The world changes, they see, hear, smell, and taste colors and sensations beyond the level of a humanoid ability. And yes, if you have a saucy DM, they might let you steal away with your companion for a few hours to have some fun and let you earn a juicy +1 bonus on spot, listening, survival checks, and more until the next in-game day. In the scenario above, I'm discussing a hetero encounter, but it's commonplace knowledge that elves tend to have more queer folks than other races. Lore-wise, it isn't that there are actually more queer folks in general, it's that elven society allows elves to openly explore their spiciality, including without having spicy times, more so than other races do. They don't have gender norms, so their men, unlike humans, are not confined to any masculine norms. They have deep emotional relationships with other men. They indulge in any action or hobby without the worry that it's classified as feminine. And there's no shame in loving whomever they love. Although it's still more common in general in the Forgotten Realms to have het relationships, elves do have an easier time falling in love with people who are the same gender as them. However, in character creation, both at the table and in supplemental fictions, there are vastly more queer elves. They're primarily bi, pan, or Achilles. Sorry, my sapphic friends. They're just more common to be male-male. So it's both canon from Neil and Steven, but also lore canon that Astarion would be queer. Both the writer and actor have stated that he's pan, so we will be saying that he is pan. For anyone curious, there is a difference between being bi and being pan. Pan means that you like folks in general, regardless of their gender. It just isn't a factor in your decision, which makes sense for elves because they live in a more gender-neutral society. Whereas bi, which is what I am, by the way, means you like two or more genders, but their gender is an important part of why you like them. For example, I like people who are all genders, but I'm attracted to qualities that we would normally consider to be feminine, which is why I love male characters like Astarion, Will, or Loki, who tend to have more feminine features or actions about their personality. But I'm just not really into characters like Thor or Barrett because they look and act too masculine for me. Another key feature of elves is that they reincarnate. So there are times in every elf's life when their soulmate, if we assume they have one, isn't going to be a part of their lives. Elven fluid ideas on love and marriage allow them to be more inclined to polyamorous relationships. However, the love an elf may feel for someone who is not their theremin would be different and less intense than it would be for the person who is their theremin or fated mate. They would not have practiced poly relationships how we see them in modern society today. For example, Halsin, Tav, and Astarion weren't going to become a throuple. Polyamory for high elves is more of serial monogamy, and that they would love someone else during the times when their fated mate hadn't reincarnated yet. But we have a whole section on soulmates, so stay tuned for that. As well, it was often common for indulging in experimentation, but typically this happened prior to meeting the person they saw a lasting and exclusive love for. But that didn't mean that when they were in a relationship with their soulmate, there weren't some elves who still had lovers on the side. Elves do not sleep. They rest and enter a trance called reverie. This is a meditative state that's as restful as true sleep, but leaves them still aware of their surroundings. Elves only need about 2 to 3/3 the amount of sleep as a human or a half-elf, which is why Astarion can sneak off and feed each night without any negative side effects to his rest. According to the Player's Handbook 5th edition, elves are capable of having sleep if they desire it, but they prefer to walk the trance. There are some subraces who are more prone to sleep over the trance, like drow, which is fascinating to me because you'd think of people who are constantly living in fear of assassination would want to be aware while they rested, but my logic, right? During the trance, elves were still aware. According to the Complete Book of Elves, during this state, elves would conduct a series of mental exercises that refresh their bodies and minds. But the biggest exercise was to walk their memories, a tool that let them remember their lives more clearly. The younger an elf is, the less control they have of their trance. Child elves were able to walk the memories of their past lives because of this. They could see, hear, feel, and remember versions of themselves. It was considered to be a blessing and oftentimes resulted in them renewing bonds with their soulmates, friends, family, and even other fae creatures from the Fae Wild. For example, Halsin meeting Thaniel in his trance when Halsin was a child was likely a result of Halsin having been close friends with Thaniel before the elves crossed from the Feywild to Faerun. Halsin being an elf, he's reincarnated since the dawn of the curse, even if he can't remember all of those past lives. Thaniel is a spirit of the forest, meaning he crosses the plains between Prime, where Faerun is, and the Feywild. When elves reach adulthood, which is around 110 years of age, they would no longer remember their past lives. So as they slowly lost more and more of that in their trance, they would more and more treasure those memories while they had them. Elven maturing isn't about their bodies, it's about their minds. By the age of 20, an elf, or even a half-elf, might look like any other human 20-year-old. However, mentally, they would still be a child, full of innocence, trust, and wonder. Now keep in mind, when I say they would still be a child, I don't mean that they think exactly like a child. They are still living a certain number of years. They just tend to be more naive in their nature. Astarion, for example, appears to be in his late 30s. When translating, he was born in the year of the Carrion Crow, 1229 DR. The story of Baldur's Gate takes place in the year of 3 sailing ships, 1492 DR. And also when translating, we can see that the year that Astarion turned, aka the year he died, was the year of day stars, 1268 DR. So he was 39 when he turned, making him still maturity-wise a child. However, he has had an additional 224 years of maturing mentally while he was a vampire spawn. Turning stops your body from aging, but it doesn't stop your mind or your soul. So that would make him now 263. The average elf lives to be 700 years or higher, and their adulthood happens between 100 and 110 years of age. High elves, such as Astarion, aged slower mentally compared to wood elves, who aged similarly to humans. So at the time he was turned, he would have been living among human peers, which means he would have taken on responsibilities as an adult, and he still would have been able to walk his past life in his trance. He would have been an innocent and trusting, youthful person. When an elf ages out of walking their past life, they begin to walk memories from their own life. They're able to relive their days, their favored moments, and they do so with such clarity that it's often used as a tool around the table to remember things from past days in the campaign. Astarion is no longer able to remember his life before he turned. If he'd been a normal elf, even at the age of 263, he'd still be able to walk his trance and relive any memories from his personal life of his choosing. However, the 224 years of constant torture and torment have bled those memories of his former life from him. If you interact with the skull of Velioth, Cazador's old master, you get a good picture of the type of punishments that were used by Cazador to strip his spawn of their past lives and memories. One of Velioth's memories, his first lesson, Cazador reached out to an old friend. Then Velioth made him watch as he drained that friend to death. In the second lesson, when Cazador attempted to rebel, Velioth didn't use his sire bond to control him into submission. He instead impaled him for 11 years to teach him a lesson about failure. It's safe to assume that these wicked actions of stripping away one's humanity in such a violent way and removing one's past life connections were passed on from Velioth to Cazador, given how much like Velioth Cazador is. As well, as we discussed in the Can Vampires Love video, Cazador happens to be obsessed with youth. Cazador allowed Leon to keep his daughter Victoria in the palace after turning him. It could have been a way to encourage Leon to stay his favored spawn and bring him more people to turn, but given how Cazador acts, it's more likely that it was related to his obsession with children. I mean, we are talking about a vampire lord who also turned his own 13-year-old niece and then forced Astarion to kidnap Gerd children, and often calls his spawn such infantilizing terms like child, son, etc. Cazador is a high elf himself. He would be well aware that 39-year-old Astarion was a child. He would have known that he was stealing his future. And since his turn, Astarion has only ever been able to have nightmares during his trance. All he can remember as he walks the Feywilds is his life as a spawn, and the torment and tortures that have come of that. Did you know that elves can have soulmates and can bond with them for eternity? Firstly, not all elves will have a soulmate, nor will all of those soulmates bond with each other. And not all elves have an elven soulmate. There are some whose soulmate is a human or a half-elf, for example. However, the majority of elves do have fated bonds with other elves. And the biggest kicker, being soulmates for elves, it doesn't have to be romantic. Just like the Parabatai bond in Shadowhunters, it can be an aromantic thing. The bonding of Theremin, being aromantic, was far more rare, but it wasn't unheard of. So what is a theremin? It was the irreversible magical ritual, one that intertwines your souls. You could feel what they feel, sense their emotions even across the planes. And when together, your power increased through your bond. You were literally one. Elven soulmates are called theremin because of the ritual of getting married, and meeting them radically changes an elf's life forever. Up until the point in which an elf meets their soulmate, they are more typically spicily adventurous. And as the guide put it, quote, experimentation with partners is no more or less odd than tasting the juice of a dozen different berries, end quote. These early years before meeting a mate were spent in self-discovery and indulgence. After meeting a mate, monogamy wasn't always required either, though they tended to be romantically involved with only their soulmate when they were both alive in unison. This, however, was not true for wood elves like it is for high elves. It is rare that a theremin doesn't instantly feel the pull of being fated mates, even when the partner themselves isn't an elf. And when it comes to the dissolving of unions built between soulmates, that's even more insanely rare. When an elf meets their soulmate, it's typically forever, and they will reunite with them again and again in every lifetime. Elves will court their theremin, taking even decades or longer to woo them into agreeing to the marriage ritual. However, the younger the elves are when they first meet, the faster they're likely to want to bond with one another. And in every lifetime, they will go through the process of bonding once again. Regardless of their pasts, traumas, or lifestyles, the moment they decide to begin the seduction of courting of their desired mate, everything else ceases to matter. For example, if they were insecure about taking a leap due to negative past encounters with other lovers being very unpleasant, that fear would start to melt away when they were with their soulmate. Even though they'd still feel those insecurities, they'd also feel an overwhelming sensation, a knowing that this was just right. This person completed them. Sadly, Astarion was only 39 when he was turned. It's unlikely that he'd have met his soulmate in this current lifetime of his. And since he couldn't remember his past life after he turned, he'd have no inclinations or hints that could lead him toward his love so they could be reunited. Granted, if you ascend him, he does conduct a similar bond on Tab. You can see my Vampire Bride video for more information on that. So it is possible that Tab was always his theremin. Now don't get your panties in a bunch, but for the sake of explaining the lore, let's assume Tav wasn't his soulmate. That would mean somewhere out there in the realms, his fated mate would be reborn and waiting, feeling his emotions tugging at their heart throughout all of the torture and torment and chaos that Cazador wrought upon him, unaware as to why they were having such feelings. This is because if they had bonded in a past life, even if they hadn't conducted the ritual again in this one, they would have felt when he died. But because his soul is still on this plane, trapped in his body, that bond would carry on, and all of his pain would flow into them. All the while, him never being able to find them and rejoin them. Now unwad your panties, and we'll go on saying that Tav is his soulmate. Now let's say you keep Astarion a spawn, and Tav is an elf who is his theremin. Unlike normal elves who cycle through reincarnation, who meet again and fall in love for the first time over and over and over, Tav would die, but Astarion would live on. This would mean that Astarion would have to wait for Tav to return, all the while remembering all of their bond, unable to start again fresh. And when they would meet again, Astarion would have to woo this new version of Tav to love him again, remembering everything that was their past, all of their memories, even the moment he had to watch his beloved age and die. Only now to see them again, they have a new face, a new personality, and they don't remember anything about him. He wouldn't just be Rory waiting as a centurion to save his Amy. He would be eternally bound, heart, mind, body, and soul, to someone that would be forever changing, who would always be living a new life, one that he couldn't start fresh with them, that he couldn't have without those memories of previous versions weighing on his heart. According to Open Grave, a manual dedicated to the undead, vampires did not cast shadows, had no reflections in mirrors, and moved in complete silence. However, the sages claimed vampires retained their souls after turning. It's often a topic argued about among DMs and GMs if vampires have a soul. Though considering Open Grave's statement from the sages, and that to become a spawn requires the twisting of one's soul, it's safe to definitively say that some vampires retain their souls. But in a way, that's all the more tragic for Astarion. A huge part of what makes an elf is that they're able to reincarnate. Their past and memories slowly leak from their reincarnated souls into the new version of them as they walk the Feywilds in the trance. They get to impart their memories, their hopes, and their persona onto the elf child who now houses their soul. It's a beautiful dance of imprinting yourself into the stream of life for all eternity. Whereas for Astarion, the moment that he died, his soul became trapped in his spawned body. He will never get to reincarnate because of how his soul was twisted in the transformation to undeath. When his body is gone, he will be gone. And as an undead, and as an elf, his soul will never be collected by a god if he managed to make it to the fugue plane at all. So Astarion was turned and trapped in his own body as a spawn, a puppet for the majority of his life. Then, after finally finding freedom, either as a spawn or an ascendant, he'll need to stay alive indefinitely, or face being trapped as a wandering soul in the planes of afterlife for all eternity, or simply ceasing to exist forever. As stated earlier, according to the 3.5e manuals in the complete Book of Elves, spicy times are sacred to elves. It isn't that they're exclusive in whom they indulge with. As we talked about, the majority of younger elves take many a lover. It's that the act in and of itself is seen as a beautiful caress of souls and bodies. When courting, an elf can spend decades wooing their desired lover. Hell, they can even spend a decade doing nothing but having spicy times. Because that 1 to 3 times a month hookup, it could last days if they wanted it to. In fact, it's well known that the marriage night is filled with a day of wild debauchery that can leave a non-elf spouse surprised and overly spent. In and of themselves, elves are known for their spicy abilities. As such, it's no surprise that Cazador, an elf himself, selected so many with elven blood to be of his 7 spawn of seduction: Dauria, Astarion, and Violet. So nearly half of his sired are elven. As well, vampires are by nature hunger-driven creatures. They obsess for blood, power, control, and sins of the spice. It's in a vampire's natural urges to seduce. Their bite itself is often seen as an aphrodisiac because of the venom they release. So knowing how deeply ingrained in spiciality and consent to said spiciality are in elves and vampires alike, we can see just how extra twisted Cazador was. And keep in mind, what Cazador did was sick, twisted, and 100% SA already, but it gets worse. Remember, elves become adults between 100 and 110 years of age. So let's assume, for easy math, 100 elf years equals 20 human years. So for every 5 human years, an elf would age 1, meaning that at 39, when turned, his own kind would consider him a child around the age of 7 or 8. Now keep in mind, elves age differently. They age mentally. And it isn't the same kind of maturity that we think of when we think of human adults and human children. A 50-year-old elf, being approximately 10, still lived 50 years. So in many aspects, they have an adult mentality. But in just as many aspects around naivety, trust, and ability to absorb what's going on in the world, they still have a lot in common with a child. Their ability to reason, to trust, to experience the world is that similar of a child. They would be incredibly overly trusting. They wouldn't make choices based on logic over emotion. And they would still have an air of innocence about them and about how they see the world. Elves also, though very promiscuous in adolescence, didn't typically start seeking to indulge in spice with partners until around 65 to 70 years of age, making it similar to human teenagers getting their first kiss around 14 or 15. Cazador would have been fully aware of this. Sebastian was one of Astarion's first, but he wasn't his actual first. He told Sebastian he had been in the cage for around 170 years. Being as Astarion is 268, that means he was only 93 when he was forced to sleep with Sebastian. Astarion would have been on the trust and innocence level of around a 17 to 18-year-old. Right, 17 to 18. Let that sink in. It isn't the same as how human CSA would be, because elves are not 100% childlike in their adolescence. But at the same time, if he was about 17, it's still a form of CSA. And if I go too deep into that rabbit hole and wonder how old he actually was when it officially started, my head will explode with righteous fury. Realistically, Astarion likely hadn't been with anyone at all at 39. Some elves could start when they were younger because they were living in human cities, but because spice was something that took decades to build up to, that isn't very likely. And although when elves start to experiment can be up for debate, what isn't up for debate is what Cazador did. And what else isn't up for debate is that Astarion was a child when he was turned. So Cazador took away and tainted a huge part of what makes an elf an elf. He violated not just Astarion, but the sacredness of his literal nature. And all the while, he was still too young and innocent to even know better. And although I personally do a mix of ascending Astarion and keeping him a spawn, I personally find such vindication in letting Astarion slaughter Cazador. Astarion and I share a similar age-related trauma, and it's not only bonded me to him as a character, but it's given me far more healing than years of therapy ever have. So the fundamentals of what make an elf are deeper than just the race they're born into. They relive their memories and their past lives as children. They walk their lives and their happiness in their trance. They reincarnate, reconnecting to their love again and again. They embrace and hold consummation as a key part of who they are and how they express themselves in their lives. All of these things, Astarion has had them either taken away or tainted. He can't remember his past before turning. In his trance, it's nothing but a walk of nightmares of Cazador. He can never reincarnate, and his body and natural desires were tainted by years of SA. Everything elven about him is lost. On a less sad note, before we all go, I wanted to thank you for watching. Writing and gaming, they're my passions, and with subscribers like you, I'm able to share those passions. Normally here, I would share the book I'm working on or a goal for the channel or something for the next video to encourage you to join me. However, after the weight of the final chapter, that just doesn't sit right with me. So instead, I'm going to leave it here, and I hope that you come and join us next week for another lore deep dive, one that will not weigh so heavy on me. And good night, darling.
And now you're all mine. And I'm all yours. Until morning, at least.